London, autumn 1974. A woman sits in a flat in the early morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes. She is 25 years old. She has been married for less than 9 months. She has been Lady Colin Campbell for less than 9 months. On the table in front of her is a newspaper, open to a story about herself. The story says she was born a man. It says she underwent a sex change operation. It says the wife of the Duke of Argyle's younger son is not and has never been a real woman. Every word of it is false. And according to her later account, the man who fed the story to the press is the man whose surname is printed on her marriage certificate. The man sleeping or not sleeping, somewhere in this city, who took the most private fact of her existence and sold it to Fleet Street for the price of a headline. She does not yet know that this morning will define the rest of her life. She does not yet know that the name on that marriage certificate, Campbell of Argyll, one of Scotland's oldest and most scandal-haunted dynasties, will become not the instrument of her destruction, but the foundation of a career built on the ruins of other people's privacy. This is the story of a girl born in Jamaica and registered as a boy. A woman who married into British aristocracy after 5 days and lost everything within 9 months, except the title. A mother who adopted two sons and funded their lives by selling the secrets of the royal family. And a 76-year-old woman who lives today in a castle she bought with the proceeds, still insisting she told the truth before anyone else would. But to understand how a woman ends up standing alone in a London flat with the morning papers telling the world a lie about her body, you have to go back much further than a marriage. You have to go back to Jamaica, to a nursery, to the moment a doctor looked at a newborn and made a decision that would take 21 years to undo, and, in a sense, would never be undone at all. This is the story of three houses. The first is the House of Ziadi, a Lebanese Jamaican mercantile dynasty built on department stores and colonial respectability and the fierce belief that appearances once constructed must never be allowed to crack. The second is the House of Campbell, the Campbells of Argyll, one of Scotland's great aristocratic names, already drenched by the 1970s in the kind of scandal that sells newspapers for decades. And the third house is the one Georgia Ariana Ziadi would build for herself, brick by crumbling brick, after the first two had used her and broken her and taught her exactly how the machinery of British elite life works. Who gets protected, who gets destroyed, and who, if they are clever enough and angry enough and shameless enough, gets to sell the story afterwards. It is the story of a woman who entered an old dynasty, learned how it operated, and then spent the rest of her life monetizing what it had taught her. But it begins, as these stories always do, with a child who had no say in any of it. The name Ziadi meant something in Jamaica. It meant shops. It meant position. It meant a family that had crossed the Atlantic from Lebanon and planted itself in the mercantile soil of the Caribbean, with the tenacity of people who understood that in a colonial society, commerce was the surest route to respectability. Michael George Ziadi was a department store owner, a man whose world was built on inventory and reputation, on the display of goods and the careful maintenance of standing in a community where everybody knew everybody and where a family's worth was measured not only in cash, but in the seamlessness of its public presentation. The Ziadis were part of Jamaica's Lebanese merchant class, a community that had carved its place in the island's social hierarchy through trade, through marriages carefully made, through the quiet accumulation of property and the unspoken understanding that what happened inside a family stayed inside a family. There is something about that world that must be understood before the story can go any further. Post-colonial Jamaica in the middle of the 20th century was a place layered with contradictions that the people living inside them would rarely have named aloud. The great houses still stood. The old money still circulated through the same dining rooms and the same church pews and the same cricket grounds where it had always circulated. British customs and British class assumptions still governed the social calendar and the marriage market and the education of children who would grow up speaking with accents, tuned to the precise frequency of their parents' ambitions. But beneath that surface, the rules were shifting. Independence was coming. The social order that had given families like the Ziadis their particular place, prosperous, respected, neither at the very top of the old planter hierarchy nor anywhere near the bottom, was under pressure from forces much larger than any single household could control. And the response of such families was, almost universally, to hold tighter, to insist more fiercely on presentation, to make the surface gleam harder, whatever might be rotting underneath. It was into this world, on the 17th of August 1949, in the parish of St. Andrew, Jamaica, that a child was born to Michael Zaidi and his wife Gloria. And from the first hours of that child's life, the family's commitment to surface over truth was tested in a way that would have consequences stretching across decades, across continents, across the front pages of British newspapers, and eventually into the private rooms of the most famous family on earth. The baby was born with fused labia and a deformed clitoris. These are medical facts, anatomical, clinical, correctable. But in 1949, Jamaica, in a family that valued outward coherence above almost everything, the response was not medical precision. It was social management. A doctor advised the parents to register the child as male. And so they did. The baby was named George William Ziadi and raised as a boy. That decision, made in a nursery, by adults who believed they were solving a problem rather than creating one, planted a wound that would take 21 years to address surgically and a lifetime to address in every other way. It was not malice. It was the logic of a world in which a wealthy family's reputation mattered more than a child's reality. The Ziadis could afford discretion. They could afford silence. They could afford to dress the child in boys' clothes and send it to boys' schools and present it to the world as something it was not. What they could not afford or would not risk was the truth. And so a girl grew up inside a lie, in a large house, in a prosperous family, on an island where the sun shone on everything except what mattered most. It is worth pausing here, because the pattern that begins in that nursery, thus wealth purchasing discretion, but not truth, family managing appearance at the cost of the person inside the appearance, is the pattern that will repeat through every act of this story. It will repeat when she marries into the Campbells. It will repeat when the tabloids come for her. It will repeat when she sits down to write about the private lives of the royal family. The machinery is always the same. A powerful institution, whether it is a family, an aristocracy, or a monarchy, constructs a public version of itself. Someone inside that institution suffers the gap between the version and the reality. And eventually, someone decides that the gap is worth exposing or exploiting or both. The first institution to run that machinery on Georgia Zidi was her own family. It would not be the last. The childhood that followed was materially comfortable and psychologically treacherous. The Ziadi household had the architecture of privilege, domestic staff, social engagements, the rhythms of a respected family in a hierarchical society. There were obligations to meet, appearances to keep, holidays taken in the manner expected of people in their position. But for the child called George, every interaction carried an invisible weight. School among boys who saw a boy. Social expectations calibrated for a sex that was not hers. The accumulating awareness, gradual, wordless at first, then undeniable, that something was fundamentally wrong with the story she had been placed inside. Not a story she had chosen, not a story she could yet name. Simply the feeling, persistent and unanswerable, that the life she was living belonged to someone else. Her father, Michael George Ziadi, remains in the public record more as a type than as an individual. The patriarch of a mercantile family, the department store owner, the man whose standing in Kingston society depended on the continued presentation of a coherent household. He was the gravitational center of the Ziadi world, not because the record tells us much about his private temperament, but because everything in that world orbited the expectations he embodied. Respectability, prosperity, silence where silence was needed. He functioned in the architecture of this family as the force that ensured the machinery of appearance kept running. Whether he suffered privately over the decision made at his child's birth, whether he questioned it in the small hours, whether he ever looked at the child called George and glimpsed the girl underneath. These are questions the public record cannot answer. What it can say is that the household he presided over maintained its facade with the discipline characteristic of families for whom social position was not inherited aristocracy, but earned commercial standing and therefore always at risk. Her mother, Gloria, later Gloria Day, would become, in her daughter's later telling, one of the central figures of damage. Campbell's memoir, Daughter of Narcissus, drew a portrait of the mother-daughter relationship so fraught that it constituted, in her account, a second and parallel wound running alongside the bodily one. Even if the documentary does not litigate the clinical label the title implies, the emotional substance is clear. Georgia grew up believing that her mother's love was conditional, that closeness could be weaponized, and that the person who should have been her fiercest protector was instead invested in the performance of a self that served the family's needs rather than the child's truth. This is not an uncommon story in families where surface matters more than substance. But in this case, the stakes were uniquely high because the performance being demanded was not merely social, it was existential. The child was being asked to perform a gender, a body, an identity that was not hers. And the mother, her daughter's telling, was complicit in that demand. That lesson would echo through every subsequent relationship with husbands, with publishers, with the British press, and with the royal family she would later claim to know intimately. If you learn early enough that the people closest to you will sacrifice your truth for their comfort, you develop certain qualities. You learn to watch, you learn to perform, you learn that intimacy is a transaction, not a gift. And you learn that information about other people's private lives is a form of power because someone once used information about yours. But there was another figure in the household whose presence quietly altered the trajectory of everything: the grandmother. Her name surfaces less frequently in the public record than it deserves because what she did was arguably the single most consequential act in the entire saga. When Georgia reached the age of 21 in 1970, her grandmother funded the corrective surgery that the family had deferred for 2 decades. $5,000. In the currency of the time, it was not a fortune. It was the price of a car, of a few months' rent in Manhattan, of a respectable holiday, and it changed everything. The surgery and the legal recognition that followed, the reissued birth certificate, the new name Georgia Ariana, did not erase 21 years of living inside a lie. But it made the future possible. It meant that the young woman who emerged from that operating theater could begin the long, complicated, never quite finished work of becoming herself on her own terms, in her own name, with a body that finally corresponded to the identity she had always carried. The grandmother does not linger in this story. She is not a public figure. She does not give interviews or write memoirs, but she is its first quiet hero, the older relative who saw what needed to be done, who believed the child when the family structure argued against belief, and who paid. That single act of recognition and expenditure made everything that followed: the reinvention, the ambition, the title, the scandal, the books, the castle, the life, physically and legally possible. From Jamaica, the trajectory moves to New York, not as glamorous escape, though the city could offer that, but as the laboratory where Georgia Ziadi began to learn the skills that would define her public life for the next half-century. Public biographies place her at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and then in a sequence of metropolitan roles that, taken together, read like a curriculum in how elite worlds operate from the inside. Modeling, work at Harrods, charity organizing, social secretary positions. Each of these was a classroom, and in each one she was, whether she knew it or not, preparing for a career that did not yet exist. In the fashion industry, she learned that presentation is everything, that the right dress in the right room at the right moment can open doors that credentials cannot. In retail, she learned aspiration as a system, the science of making people want what they see, the alchemy of display and desire. In charity work and social organizing, she learned the thing that would matter most of all: the way doors open and close in the upper reaches of Anglo-American society. She learned that names are currency, that proximity to the right people at the right dinner table is worth more than a university degree, that gossip, handled with intelligence and timing, is not idle chatter, but a medium of exchange as potent as money, and more dangerous because, unlike money, it cannot be taken back once spent. She was not merely reinventing herself after the surgery. She was studying the operating system of privilege, learning its grammar, its gestures, its passwords, and she proved to be an exceptional student. New York in the early 1970s rewarded exactly this kind of social intelligence. The city's upper echelons were fluid enough that a striking, Sharp-witted, well-spoken woman from a good Jamaican family with cosmopolitan ancestors could find her way into rooms that the more rigid hierarchies of London might have closed to her. She made connections. She learned to read people with the speed and accuracy of someone who had spent a childhood reading rooms for danger. And she developed the theatrical self-presentation, the voice pitched to carry, the gestures calibrated for effect, the unapologetic directness that could register as either confidence or aggression, depending on who was receiving it, that would later become her permanent public brand. But underneath the polish, the original wound never fully healed. She had been made to live as someone she was not. She had been failed by the people who should have protected her. And she had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the surface story and the real story are almost never the same thing. That knowledge would eventually make her one of the most dangerous women in British public life. Now a second house enters the story, and it arrives trailing a darkness of its own. Lord Colin Ivor Campbell was born on the 14th of May, 1946, the youngest son of Ian Campbell, the 11th Duke of Argyll, and his third wife, Louise Clews. To carry the name Campbell of Argyll was to inherit one of Scotland's most storied surnames, a name that conjured Highland castles, ancient chieftainship, military honor, and the deep romantic glamour of the Scottish aristocracy at its most historically resonant. The family seated in Verray had stood for centuries. The dukedom was among the most senior in Scotland. The name alone opened every door in the British Isles. But by the time Colin Campbell was growing up, the Argyll name had acquired a second and rather different set of associations. His father had seen to that. Ian Campbell, the 11th Duke, was a man whose personal life had become a form of national spectacle. He had married 4 times, he had gambled extravagantly, he had drunk with the abandon of a man who believed the title insulated him from consequence. And in 1963, his divorce from Margaret, the Duchess of Argyll, had produced one of the most devastating court cases in 20th century British history. The details that emerged during those proceedings, the photographs, the accusations, the systematic and forensic destruction of Margaret's reputation, had convulsed the public and turned the Argyll name into a synonym for the kind of aristocratic degeneracy that fascinated and appalled the nation in equal measure. The headless man photographs, the allegations of promiscuity deployed as judicial weapons, the spectacle of a duke using the full machinery of the British legal system to humiliate his wife with a thoroughness and a viciousness that later generations would recognize as misogyny operating under the protection of law. That divorce was not background noise in the house where Colin Campbell grew up. It was atmosphere, it was inheritance. It was the unspoken understanding that in the Argyll family, the boundaries between private behavior and public spectacle had already been demolished. That scandal was not something that happened to other families, but something that lived in the walls. Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, had entered her marriage as one of the most celebrated beauties and socialites in Britain. She had been a debutante of the year, a woman whose face had graced magazine covers, whose wardrobe was legendary, whose position in London society had seemed unassailable. She left the divorce courts a broken woman, her reputation shredded, her private life turned into public property, her name a byword for aristocratic disgrace. The judge had called her a woman of low morality. The press had printed everything it could get its hands on. And the Duke, the man who had pursued her, married her, lived with her, had been the one to hand the ammunition over. The lesson was as clear as it was cruel. Women who entered the orbit of the Argyll name did so at considerable risk to their dignity, their privacy, and their capacity to control their own story. The family did not merely tolerate scandal, it generated scandal. And when scandal came, it was the women who paid. That pattern had been established long before Georgia Ziada ever heard the name Campbell. It would repeat with devastating precision when it was her turn. Colin Campbell inherited that atmosphere, the way other sons inherit furniture or debts. He was, by the accounts that survive in peerage records and scattered social diary mentions, the younger son, not the heir, not the duke in waiting, but a man carrying a surname that opened doors while simultaneously setting expectations he could not always meet. There is a particular kind of brittleness that attaches to the younger sons of scandal-stained great families. The name is enormous, the personal resources are not, and the world keeps measuring the man against the title and finding the man insufficient. Whether Colin Campbell experienced that gap consciously or simply lived inside it is something the record does not fully reveal. What it does reveal is that the Argyll men had developed a pattern, reputation defended through aggression, intimacy weaponized when it suited, the courts treated as instruments of personal warfare, and that this pattern was not one man's failing, but the culture of the house. There was a bridge between these two worlds, and her name was Lady Jean Campbell. Colin's half sister was a woman whose own biography read like a novel that could not decide its genre. She had been married to Norman Mailer, had moved between literary New York and aristocratic Scotland with a restless intelligence, and had ties to Jamaica through the interconnecting social circuits that linked the island's elite families to the wider Anglophone world of money, title, and ambition. Jean was, in many ways, the most interesting Campbell of her generation. She had the family name and the family nerve, but she had also seen enough of the world beyond Argyll to understand that the name could be a tool as well as a weight. She is credited in social accounts with having played a role in arranging the introduction between Colin and Georgia. And if that is true, then the marriage that would consume so much of George's life was not a random collision, but a socially engineered event. The kind of match that happens when overlapping elite networks notice a gap that can be filled. Jean was the connective tissue between the Ziadi world and the Campbell world, the living proof that two families separated by oceans and class structures and vastly different histories could still overlap at the edges, at the right party, through the right introduction, in the right city, at the right moment. And there was a wider web. Through the tangle of Argyll marriages and step relationships, Barbara Cartland had been stepmother to the Duchess of Argyll's daughter. The Campbell social network brushed the outer edges of the world that surrounded the British royal family. These were not intimate connections. They were gossamer threads, the kind that link one prominent household to another through charity committees, country house weekends, mutual acquaintances, and the informal architecture of the British upper class at leisure. But they mattered, because they meant that when Georgia Ziadi became Lady Colin Campbell, she would be entering not merely a family but a network, and that network would eventually lead her, by careful degrees and by sheer force of personality, to the doorstep of the most scrutinized family on earth. The marriage happened on the 23rd of March, 1974. Georgia Ziadi had known Lord Colin Campbell for 5 days. 5 days. That fact alone carries the weight of everything that follows. In a lighter story, it would be a romantic anecdote. The impulsive foolishness of two people caught in the headlong momentum of attraction. But in this story, it is something more troubling and more revealing. This was the act of a woman who had spent 21 years living as someone she was not, who had undergone surgery to become herself, who had painstakingly rebuilt her identity in New York, and who now saw in the offer of a title and a famous surname something irresistible: the chance to be simplified, to be Lady Colin Campbell. To be, in the eyes of the world, not a complicated woman with a complicated past, but a wife, an aristocrat, someone whose name told you everything you thought you needed to know. The world likes titles because they tidy people up. They resolve ambiguity. They place a person inside an institution older and grander than any individual life, and they signal to everyone who hears them that this person belongs. For a woman who had spent her entire childhood profoundly unbelonging, misregistered, misrecognized, forced into a category that did not fit her, known by a name that was not hers, the appeal of that tidying was powerful beyond what anyone who has not lived through such displacement can easily imagine. And the title she was acquiring was not some minor courtesy. It was Campbell of Argyll. It carried centuries, it carried weight, it carried, though she could not yet fully know how heavily, a legacy of marriages that ended in very public ruin. They married, she became Lady Colin Campbell. And for a moment, perhaps only a moment, the two houses converge. The Ziadi drive for respectability and the Campbell aura of aristocratic grandeur fused into something that looked, from the outside, like elevation. The girl from Jamaica had entered the British peerage. The child who had been registered as George William was now, formally, legally, socially, the wife of a duke's youngest son. The surface was immaculate. The social world that received this marriage was a world built on just such surfaces. London in the mid-1970s was a place where the old aristocratic networks still functioned with remarkable efficiency, even as the country around them lurched through economic crisis and cultural upheaval. The social columns still tracked who married whom. The country house weekends still gathered the same families in the same drawing rooms. The rituals of presentation, the right clothes, the right addresses, the right charities, still mattered enormously to the people who moved through those circles, precisely because the world outside was becoming less and less impressed by them. To be Lady Colin Campbell in that milieu was to hold a passport, however recently issued. It meant invitations. It meant recognition. It meant that doors, which had always been ajar for a beautiful and socially adroit woman, were now fully open, because the name on the card was one that everybody already knew. And Georgia seized that passport with both hands. She had spent years learning how these worlds worked from the outside. Now she was inside, and the speed of her social navigation was remarkable. She understood instinctively what many people born into privilege never quite grasp, that the performance of belonging is as important as belonging itself, and that the performance must never look like performance. She dressed the part, she spoke the part, she moved through the rooms with the confidence of a woman who had been told all her life that she did not fit, and who had decided finally, irrevocably, that she would fit, that she would make herself fit by sheer force of will, if the world would not fit around her. But the surface was all there was. The marriage was too fast. The husband came from a family that treated scandal as a form of patrimony. The wife carried a history that, in the wrong hands, could be turned into a weapon more devastating than anything the Argyle divorce courts had produced. And the world they were entering together, the world of titled marriages, of social columns and quiet judgments, and the breathtaking viciousness of the British upper class when it senses vulnerability, was a world that rewarded conformity and punished exposure with a thoroughness that neither money nor ambition could deflect. Within days of the wedding, she sensed that something was wrong. The details of what went wrong and how quickly. The words said, the silences, the first flicker of something in his manner that told her this was not what she had imagined, would emerge later, in her own telling, in court filings, in the press. But the feeling came almost immediately. She would later say that she knew something was awry almost from the start, that the man she had married in such breathless haste was not the man she had thought she was marrying. The fairy tale was dissolving before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry. She had barely learned to sign her new name, and already the name was beginning to feel less like a shelter than a trap. What makes this moment so devastating, when viewed from the distance of decades, is the completeness of the reversal. She had gone from a childhood in which she was misidentified by her own family to a marriage in which she would be misrepresented by her own husband. The same mechanism, other people defining her, other people controlling the story of her body, was about to fire again in a different country under a different name, with consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. The surgery had given her a body that was finally hers. The marriage was about to take that body and make it public property again. She did not yet know the worst of it. She did not yet know that the most intimate fact of her life, the fact of her birth, her body, her corrective surgery, was about to be handed to the British tabloid press by the very man whose surname she now carried. She did not yet know that the title Lady Colin Campbell was about to function not as a mark of belonging, but as a magnifying glass through which the public would examine and judge and mock the most private thing she had ever survived. She was 24 years old. She had been married for less than a month, and the institution she had entered was preparing to do to her what it had already done to Margaret, Duchess of Argyll: use the intimate details of a woman's life as ammunition in a war she had not started and could not win. That was the first lesson the House of Campbell would teach her. It would not be the last. There is a version of this story, the version that the social columns might have printed in the spring of 1974, in which everything works. In that version, the whirlwind romance is merely romantic, the speed of the courtship evidence of passion rather than desperation, and the new Lady Colin Campbell glides into the life she has married without friction or revelation. It is worth dwelling in that version for a moment, not because it was true, but because she believed in it, briefly, with the totality of someone who had spent a lifetime assembling the conditions for exactly this transformation. The weeks and months immediately following the wedding were the period when reinvention still appeared to be succeeding. Georgia had become Lady Colin Campbell, and the name worked like a key. It opened rooms that she had previously entered through charm and social dexterity alone. Now she entered them as a matter of right, because a titled woman in 1970s London was still, in the circles that mattered, treated as someone whose presence required no further justification. The London that received her was a city of contradictions. The economy was lurching, the miners were striking, the political order was fraying. But the world of the upper class, the world of townhouses and charity lunches and country weekends and the social season, continued to operate with the imperturbable self-assurance of people who had always believed that whatever happened to Britain, their particular version of it would endure. She dressed beautifully. She spoke with the kind of confident, slightly theatrical precision that made people pay attention. She was tall, striking, and possessed of a directness that some found charming and others found unsettling, but that nobody ignored. At dinner parties, she could hold a room. At charity events, she could work the crowd with the fluency of someone who had studied these rituals from the outside and now performed them from the inside with the zeal of the recently converted. There was, in those early months, something genuinely exhilarating about watching her operate, or so later accounts suggest, because she brought to the role of an aristocratic wife an energy and an appetite that the role as typically inhabited did not require. Most women who became Lady Somebody did so by birth or by the slow gravitational pull of their social class. Georgia had arrived by sheer velocity. She had married a duke's son after 5 days. She had crossed an ocean and a class boundary and a gender reassignment in the space of a few years, and she was determined to make it stick. The social world she entered was built on a set of assumptions so deeply held that the people who lived inside them rarely articulated them. The first assumption was that family mattered more than achievement. The second was that discretion was the highest social virtue. The third was that the surface, the correct clothes, the correct address, the correct manner of speech, the correct opinions delivered at the correct volume, was not merely important but constitutive. You were what you presented, and if the presentation was flawless, nobody was required to ask what lay beneath. For a woman whose entire life had been shaped by the catastrophic consequences of exactly this logic, the logic that said a child's registration mattered more than a child's body, that a family's appearance mattered more than a person's truth. There was a deep and perhaps unrecognized irony in her eagerness to succeed within it. She was trying to win at the very game that had nearly destroyed her. But there were genuine pleasures too, and the script must honor them, because without them the later devastation has no weight. She had a title. She had a husband, however imperfect he was turning out to be. She had access, for the first time in her life, to a world that valued her presence rather than merely tolerating it. She had the intoxicating sense that the long struggle, the childhood displacement, the years of bodily confusion, the surgery, the reinvention, had finally arrived somewhere. The somewhere might have been unstable. It might have been built on a 5-day courtship and a surname with a scandalous history. But it was somewhere, and for a woman who had spent 21 years being nowhere she belonged, that mattered more than the cracks she was already beginning to sense. The social circles she moved through in those months were the outermost rings of the world she would later write about with such devastating authority. These were not the innermost circles of the royal court. They were the broader network of aristocratic and upper-class families whose lives intersected with the monarchy at charity galas, at Ascot, at the kind of country weekends where a well-placed conversation over drinks could yield information that would take a journalist months to uncover. The names on the invitation lists were names that would have meant nothing to the general public but everything to the people in those rooms. Old families, titled families, families whose social influence operated through networks so well established that they were invisible to anyone who did not already belong. She was watching, she was listening, and she was learning, with the attentiveness of a born outsider who had trained herself to pass as an insider, how the machinery of elite British life actually functioned. She learned who owed whom. She learned who despised whom beneath the surface of cordial luncheons. She learned which marriages were genuine partnerships and which were strategic arrangements held together by property and children, and the mutual understanding that divorce was more expensive than unhappiness. She learned where the money came from and where it went, and more importantly, she learned that money, in these circles, was rarely discussed but always present, shaping every decision, every alliance, every carefully maintained friendship. And she learned how information moved through these networks. Gossip was not idle in this world. It was structural. It was the currency of power, the mechanism by which reputations were made and unmade, the invisible infrastructure that held the whole glittering edifice together. A word dropped at the right dinner could elevate a newcomer or destroy a rival. A confidence shared with the wrong person could undo a lifetime of careful social construction. The people in these rooms understood this instinctively. Georgia was learning it consciously, with the systematic attention of someone who intended to remember every lesson. She would remember all of it. She would use all of it. But not yet, because the marriage was already failing. And what had looked for a few weeks like the beginning of a life was already becoming the beginning of an education. The cracks appeared with a speed that left almost no room for denial. The marriage did not decay over years. as many unhappy marriages do, with the slow accumulation of disappointments and silences and the gradual retreat into separate bedrooms and separate lives. It curdled almost immediately. Within weeks of the wedding, the relationship between Georgia and Lord Colin had soured into something that bore no resemblance to the romantic whirlwind that had produced it. The details that later emerge in her accounts, in press summaries, in the language of court filings, paint a picture of a household in which the initial intoxication gave way almost overnight to hostility, accusation, and a kind of intimate warfare that drew on the worst instincts of both parties. There is something about the speed of that deterioration that deserves attention because it tells you something crucial about the nature of the match. This was not a marriage that failed because two fundamentally compatible people grew apart over time. It was a marriage that failed because two people who barely knew each other, 5 days, remember, 5 days, discovered in the unforgiving intimacy of shared life that they were not merely incompatible, but combustible. She had married a title and found a man. He had married a woman and discovered a history, and neither of them was equipped, by temperament or by the traditions of their respective worlds, to handle what that discovery meant. She would later allege that he beat her. That claim, which recurs in her own accounts and in profiles drawn from her telling, must be handled with the care it deserves, attributed to her, distinguished from verified court records, and understood as part of a narrative that she has had decades to shape. But the claim itself is less important for the purposes of this story than what it reveals about the dynamics of the household. Whether the violence was physical, psychological, or both, and her accounts suggest both, the marriage had become, within months of the ceremony, a place of danger rather than shelter. The promises that titles make, stability, belonging, the warm certainty of being claimed by something larger than oneself, had evaporated. In their place was something far more familiar to Georgia, far more recognizable from her childhood than she could possibly have wanted. A household in which the person she was required to be and the person she actually was were once again in irreconcilable conflict. The woman who had entered the title seeking protection had found instead that the title offered no protection at all. It amplified everything. It made every private failure into a potential public spectacle. It meant that her marriage was not merely her marriage, but a Campbell marriage, carrying the accumulated weight of the family's history of marital destruction. And it placed her inside a family whose most recent and most famous marital collapse had ended with a wife's sexual history being read aloud in open court. The parallels with Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, must have been impossible to ignore. If she knew the details, and given the circle she now moved in, she almost certainly did. Another woman, another Campbell marriage, another slow-motion disaster in which the wife's private body would become public property. Lord Colin, for his part, remains a more difficult figure to render with precision, because the public record is shaped overwhelmingly by her account rather than his. He was the younger son of a duke. He carried a great name without, it seems, possessing the resources or the stability to sustain its weight. He had grown up in the aftermath of his father's catastrophic divorce, in a household where the boundaries between private behavior and public scandal had been abolished. Whether he was a cruel man by nature or a weak man made cruel by circumstance is a question the documentary cannot definitively answer. What it can say is that the marriage produced, in very short order, exactly the kind of intimate devastation that the Argyll name had been producing for a generation. The pattern held. The House of Campbell did what the House of Campbell did. And then came the blow that would change everything. The marriage lasted approximately 9 months. The separation, when it came, was bitter, but not unusual. Bitter separations were the Argyll family's speciality. What was unusual, what was unprecedented in its cruelty, was what happened next. According to George's later accounts, accounts that have been repeated in profiles, in interviews, in the language of legal actions, Lord Colin Campbell fed the British press a version of his wife's medical history that was not merely distorted but fabricated. The story that appeared in the tabloids was not that Lady Colin Campbell had been born with a genital malformation and undergone corrective surgery. That would have been private, humiliating, but at least true. The story that appeared was that she had been born male and had undergone a sex change operation, that she was, in the language of the headlines, really a man. The distinction matters enormously, and the documentary must make it absolutely clear. A baby born with fused labia is not a baby born male. Corrective surgery on a genital malformation is not a sex change operation. The tabloid version was not a simplification of the truth. It was a lie, A lie that took the most vulnerable fact of her existence and weaponized it for maximum public impact. And according to her account, the source of that lie was the man she had married. To understand what that felt like, you have to hold several things in your mind at once. You have to hold a nursery in Jamaica, where a doctor's advice had set a child on a 21-year journey through the wrong gender. You have to hold the grandmother's $5,000, which had finally made it possible for Georgia to live as herself. You have to hold the whirlwind wedding, the hope of simplification, the belief that a title could function as armor. And then you have to imagine what it meant to open a newspaper and discover that all of it, the childhood pain, the surgical correction, the legal recognition, the fragile new identity built brick by careful brick, had been handed to the press and twisted into something grotesque. The headline did not merely expose her, it undid her. It took the story of a woman who had fought for 21 years to be recognized as herself and replaced it with a story in which she was once again not really who she claimed to be. That is the first fracture, not the separation from Lord Colin, though that mattered, not the end of the marriage, though that mattered too. The first fracture was the publication of the body. The moment when the most private fact of her life was seized by the machinery of the British tabloid press and turned into a commodity. It was the moment when Lady Colin Campbell ceased to be merely an unhappy wife and became a public figure defined by a lie about her sex. And it was the moment when the pattern that had begun in that Jamaican nursery, powerful institutions managing the narrative of her body for their own purposes, completed its first full revolution in the British press. The newspapers ran with it, of course they did. A duke's daughter-in-law who was supposedly born a man was exactly the kind of story that the tabloids of the 1970s existed to publish. It had sex, class, scandal, and the tantalizing suggestion that the entire British aristocracy was even stranger than the public suspected. The story moved through Fleet Street with the viral efficiency of information that is simultaneously shocking and entertaining. The kind of story that people discussed at work and at pubs and at dinner tables with a mixture of prurient fascination and moral disapproval that the tabloids had long since learned to exploit. The fact that the story was false, that the medical reality was more complicated and more sympathetic than the headline allowed, did not slow the machinery for a moment. Machinery of that kind does not pause for nuance. It does not pause for correction. It does not pause to consider what the publication of such a story might mean to the woman at its center, a woman who had already spent 21 years being defined by other people's versions of her body. It consumes, it publishes, it moves on to the next scandal, and the person at the center of the story is left to deal with the wreckage alone. The wreckage, in this case, was comprehensive. Overnight, Lady Colin Campbell became a different kind of public figure. She was no longer the briefly interesting wife of a duke's youngest son. She was a scandal. She was a punchline. She was the subject of the kind of prurient speculation that attaches to anyone whose body has been made public property. The whispered conversations, the sidelong glances, the absolute certainty of strangers that they had the right to an opinion about her anatomy. The social world that had welcomed her as a titled wife now regarded her with a mixture of fascination and repulsion that was, in its own way, as Victorian as the drawing rooms in which it was expressed. She had been exposed. And in the Britain of the 1970s, exposure of this particular kind carried a stigma so deep and so comprehensive that most people subjected to it simply disappeared from public life. They retreated. They accepted the verdict. They let the world move on without them. Each thread of the story responded differently to the explosion. Lord Colin receded. The details of his life after the separation are sparser in the public record, and the documentary should reflect that sparseness rather than manufacturing a fullness that the sources cannot support. He had done what the Argyle men did. He had used intimacy as a weapon, and then he had stepped back, leaving the consequences to the woman whose secrets he had sold. Georgia did not step back. She could not afford to. The tabloid story was not merely embarrassing, it was existential. If the public accepted the version of her that the press was selling, that she was really a man, that the title was a fraud, that the woman behind the name was not what she appeared, then everything she had built since the surgery would be destroyed. Her identity, her credibility, her social standing, the name itself. And so she did something that most people in her position, in that era, would not have had the nerve or the resources to do. She fought. The legal battles that followed are documented in public records, including a VLEX entry recording litigation against associated newspapers and successful libel actions against publications that had claimed she was born a boy and had undergone a sex change. The fights were not simple. They required money, of which she had a limited supply. They required stamina, of which she had an almost inexhaustible reserve. They required the willingness to stand in a courtroom and discuss the most intimate facts of her body in front of strangers, which was, in a sense, the cruelest irony of all. Because the very privacy that had been violated was the privacy she now had to surrender again in order to prove that the violation had been unjust. The law offered protection, but the price of that protection was further exposure. She paid it. Even if the documentary does not trace every filing and every hearing, the arc of the legal fight is essential to the story because it reveals something fundamental about who Georgia was becoming. She was not the kind of woman who suffered in silence. She was not the kind of woman who retreated into private shame and allowed the public narrative to harden around a falsehood. She was the kind of woman who hired solicitors, who went to court, who demanded that the record be corrected, and who understood, with an instinct sharpened by a lifetime of having her identity defined by others, that narrative must be seized, litigated, and controlled, or it will be used against you forever. The courts became her arena. The courtroom became the place where she refused to accept the story the world had decided to tell about her. And in that refusal, she discovered something about herself that would shape everything that came after. She was a fighter. Not a quiet, dignified, turn the other cheek kind of fighter. A public, relentless, take you to court and make you pay kind of fighter. The kind of fighter that polite society finds deeply uncomfortable because polite society prefers its women to suffer gracefully and in private. The libel victories were important not because they made the story go away, and stories like that never entirely go away, but because they established a precedent in her own life. She had been wronged publicly, in the most intimate way imaginable, and she had fought back publicly and won. That sequence, humiliation, then counterattack, then the discovery that counterattack could succeed, would shape everything that followed. It was the template for her entire subsequent career. She would be dismissed, and she would respond. She would be mocked, and she would litigate. She would be underestimated, and she would publish. The lesson of the first fracture was not that the world was cruel, though it was. The lesson was that cruelty could be answered, and that the answer, if delivered with sufficient force and sufficient precision, could become its own source of power. And then there was the matter of the title. After the divorce was finalized in 1975, Lady Colin Campbell retained the style Lady Colin Campbell. This was not automatic, it was not inevitable, it was a choice. And it was one of the most revealing choices in the entire story. She kept the name of the man who had betrayed her. She kept the aristocratic wrapper of a marriage that had lasted less than a year, and she did so not out of sentimentality, and not because she still felt any attachment to Lord Colin, but because she understood something that the social world around her had spent centuries pretending was not true. That a title is a tool. It is a brand. It is a mechanism of access and authority. And once you have it, surrendering it voluntarily is an act of self-destruction that no amount of moral satisfaction can justify. By keeping the title, she was doing more than preserving a social convenience. She was refusing to allow the institution that had broken her to reclaim the one thing of value it had given her. The marriage had cost her privacy, dignity, and safety. It had given her in return a name, and she was not going to give it back. In the social world she moved through, this decision was understood for exactly what it was, an act of defiance. The polite thing to do, the expected thing, the thing that would have allowed everyone to move on and pretend the whole unfortunate episode had never happened, would have been to revert to her maiden name and disappear from the social register. By refusing to do so, she was insisting on her presence. She was insisting that the marriage had happened, that the title was hers, and that if the Campbell name carried scandal, well, the scandal had not been of her making. That decision would define her public identity for the next half-century. Every book she wrote, every television appearance she made, every royal commentary she delivered would be delivered under the name Lady Colin Campbell. The title that a 5-day courtship had given her would outlast the marriage by 50 years. It would outlast Lord Colin's public relevance entirely, and it would become, in time, one of the most commercially successful aristocratic brands in Britain. Not because of what the marriage had been, but because of what the woman who survived it would build from its wreckage. The irony was exquisite, and it was the kind of irony that the British class system, in all its Baroque complexity, was uniquely capable of producing. The same system that had enabled her humiliation, and the system that valued titles, that rewarded surfaces, that turned private lives into public spectacles, was the system that now, inadvertently, provided her with the instrument of her comeback. The title Lady Colin Campbell had been meant to domesticate her, to contain her within the predictable role of an aristocratic wife. Instead, it would become a weapon, a brand, a permanent reminder to the world that she had been inside the house and that she knew what the house looked like from the inside. The aristocratic world that had consumed her and spat her out believed in the mid 1970s that it was done with her. She was a briefly notorious ex wife, a tabloid curiosity, a woman whose claim to the titled world was built on a marriage so short and so scandalous that polite society could be expected to forget her within a season or two. The salons would close, the invitations would slow. The name would become, in the mouths of those who had once welcomed her, a cautionary tale about marrying in haste and the dangers of admitting outsiders into the charmed circle. They were wrong. They were profoundly, spectacularly wrong. Because the woman who walked out of that marriage was not the woman who had walked into it. The woman who walked into it had been seeking shelter, simplification, belonging. The woman who walked out had been educated. She had learned how the aristocratic world really worked. Not the version in the social columns, but the version that operated behind the drawing room doors. She had learned that intimacy was currency, that secrets were power, that the gap between the public image and the private reality was not a flaw in the system, but the system itself. And she had learned through the most painful possible tutorial that a woman who possesses information about the private lives of powerful people and who is willing to use it need never be powerless again. She had lost a marriage, she had kept a title, she had won a legal fight, and she had acquired something far more valuable than any of those things: knowledge. The knowledge of how elite Britain manufactured, maintained, and defended its stories. The knowledge of where the facade was thinnest. In the marriages, always in the marriages, where the distance between what was promised and what was delivered was widest and most painful. And the slowly forming understanding that there was a market, a large, hungry, endlessly renewable market, as they, for the truth behind those stories, provided it was delivered by someone who could claim to have been inside the room when the mask came off. She was not yet a writer. She was not yet a royal biographer. She was not yet the woman whose name would become synonymous with palace gossip and aristocratic exposé. She was, in the late 1970s, simply a survivor. A woman who had passed through one of the most degrading experiences the British social system could inflict and emerge, battered but unbroken, with her title intact and her appetite for the world undiminished. The years between the divorce and her emergence as an author would be years of quiet accumulation. Social connections maintained, information gathered, the slow assembly of a network of contacts and confidants that would eventually give her access to the private lives of people far more powerful and far more protected than Lord Colin Campbell had ever been. The old world thought it had finished her. Instead, it had taught her the one skill she would need for the rest of her life: the art of weaponized disclosure. She had been the subject of disclosure. She had been the victim of a narrative she did not control. And she had learned, through pain and through litigation and through the stubborn refusal to surrender her name, that the only way to survive in a world built on stories is to become the one who tells them. And somewhere, in a world she had not yet entered, in a palace she had never visited, in a marriage she could not yet have imagined, a young woman named Diana Spencer was beginning her own journey into an institution that operated by exactly the same rules. The same insistence on surface, the same punishment of deviation, the same willingness to sacrifice a woman's private life on the altar of public performance. Their paths had not yet crossed. But the machinery that would eventually bring them together, and the machinery of fame, of scandal, of royal dysfunction, of books that sold in the millions, was already turning. Lady Colin Campbell did not yet know that Diana would make her career. Diana did not yet know that Lady Colin Campbell existed. But the story was already written in the structure of the institutions they both inhabited, and it was only a matter of time before it played itself out. The years between the divorce and the first book were not empty. They were preparatory. They were the years in which Lady Colin Campbell stopped being a woman to whom things happened and became a woman who made things happen, slowly, methodically, with a patience that would have surprised the people who dismissed her as a tabloid curiosity and expected her to fade. She did not fade. She stayed. She stayed in London. She stayed in the social world that had tried to expel her. She stayed in the rooms where the conversations happened, at the parties where the introductions were made, on the invitation list that ambitious people would have killed to join. And she stayed not by pretending the scandal had never happened. That would have required a level of collective amnesia that even the British upper class with all its talent for selective memory, could not have sustained. But by being too interesting, too sharp, too present, and too useful to ignore, she had something that many of the people around her did not. She had survived public destruction and come out of it with her nerve intact. In a social world that valued composure above almost everything, that nerve was its own form of currency. People were fascinated by her, they were wary of her, and they talked to her because people who have been through scandal attract the confidences of people who are living through their own. That is the mechanism that must be understood before the next act can make sense. Lady Colin Campbell did not become a royal biographer by accident, by a single stroke of luck, or by inventing sources from whole cloth. She became a royal biographer through the slow, persistent, socially embedded process of becoming the kind of person to whom other insiders tell their secrets. She cultivated contacts. She maintained friendships with people who moved in royal adjacent circles, people who attended the same charity events as members of the royal household, who weekended at the same country houses, who shared hairdressers and dressmakers and solicitors with the women around the palace. She positioned herself, with a social intelligence honed by decades of outsider observation, as someone who could be trusted with information, or at least as someone to whom information could be passed with a reasonable expectation that it would be used but not traced. The network she built through the 1980s was not a spy ring. It was a salon, informal, unstructured, bound by mutual interest and mutual indiscretion rather than formal agreement. The people who fed her information did so for their own reasons, and those reasons were as varied and as human as the people themselves, because they were angry at someone in the royal circle and wanted the anger to find its way into print without being traced back to them, because they were fascinated by the dramas playing out behind closed doors and could not resist sharing what they knew, because they enjoyed the vicarious thrill of proximity to a woman who was actually willing to publish what they would only whisper, or simply because Lady C was excellent company and they forgot in the warmth of a long lunch and a second bottle of wine that she was also keeping score. She was, in the language of intelligence work, a collector. She gathered fragments from dozens of sources, cross-referenced them, tested them against what she already knew about how the aristocratic and royal worlds operated, and assembled them into a picture that no single source could have provided. Through these years, her public profile shifted in ways that the social columns tracked without fully understanding. First, she was a curiosity, the ex-wife with the scandalous past who kept turning up at the right parties, who wore the right clothes and said outrageous things with the kind of theatrical confidence that could make a room go quiet. Then she was a personality, a woman whose sharp tongue and unapologetic directness made her a reliable source of color at any gathering, the guest you invited because she would say what everyone else was thinking but no one else would dare voice aloud. There was something almost performative about her presence at these events, and she knew it and she did not care. She had learned in the crucible of her own public humiliation that visibility was survival. The moment she disappeared from the social landscape would be the moment the landscape forgot her. Then she became something more specific and more dangerous, a woman who was understood within the social world she inhabited to know things. Not merely to gossip, which was universal in these circles and as unremarkable as the canapes, but to know, to possess specific, verified, consequential information about the private lives of people who believed their privacy was absolute. She had the gift of making people talk to her. She had the gift of remembering what they said, and she had developed, over the course of more than a decade, an almost encyclopedic understanding of the interconnections between the aristocratic families, the courtiers, the social figures, and the royal household itself. She could trace a rumor from its source, through 3 social layers, to its eventual destination. She could identify which marriages were under strain from the way the wives behaved at charity dinners. She could tell, from the seating arrangements at a country weekend, who was in favor and who had fallen out. These were not trivial skills. They were the skills of a social anthropologist operating inside a closed system, and she had been honing them for years. The shift from socialite to insider was gradual, but by the late 1980s, it was unmistakable. People who had once invited her because she was entertaining now invited her because they were slightly afraid of what she might already know, and people who would never have invited her at all, people in the innermost circles of the royal world, found that their own confidants were talking to her, passing along fragments that she assembled with remarkable skill into a coherent picture of what was happening behind the palace walls. There is something worth sitting with in that transformation, because it reveals one of the central paradoxes of the British class system that this story keeps circling back to. The same world that had tried to destroy her through exposure. The exposure of her body, her medical history, her most intimate secrets, was now being made vulnerable by her capacity to expose others. She had learned, through her own destruction, exactly how the machinery of revelation worked. She knew what it felt like to have private information weaponized. She knew the mechanics of the leak, the planted story, the deniable source, and she had decided, with a clarity that was either admirable or terrifying depending on your perspective, that if the world was going to operate this way, she might as well be the one pulling the lever. The 1980s were also the decade in which the royal marriage that would define her career was publicly unraveling. Charles and Diana had married in 1981 in a ceremony watched by 750 million people worldwide, and the fairy tale had begun to crack almost as quickly as Lady C's own marriage had, though on an incomparably larger stage. The separate lives, the competing camps, the affairs, the eating disorder, the emotional warfare conducted through press leaks and carefully timed public appearances. All of it was happening behind the walls of Kensington Palace and Highgrove, and all of it was filtering in fragments and whispers and half understood rumors through the exact social networks that Lady Colin Campbell had spent a decade cultivating. She was not the only person who knew that the royal marriage was failing. Plenty of people knew. Journalists knew, courtiers knew, Diana's friends knew, Charles's friends knew. The difference was that most of them were either too loyal, too cautious, or too embedded in the system to say so publicly. Lady C was none of those things. She was loyal to no institution. She had no career within the royal household to protect. She had no social position that depended on the palace's goodwill. The palace had never given her its goodwill in the first place, and she had a motive that transcended mere gossip. She needed money. She had a life to fund. And she had two adopted sons who depended on her. The adoption of Misha and Dima from Russia is one of the threads that the story cannot afford to lose because it transforms the moral texture of everything that follows. In 1991, 1992, and 1993, Lady Colin Campbell traveled to Russia. The passport records and later profiles confirmed the trips to adopt two boys. The process was bureaucratic, exhausting, emotionally grueling, and expensive. The Russia she encountered was a country in the throes of post-Soviet collapse. Chaotic, impoverished, its orphanages overwhelmed, its systems buckling under the weight of a society that had lost its organizing principle overnight. The children in those orphanages were the most visible casualties of that collapse. Small faces and institutional cots, waiting for a future that the state could no longer provide. She went there not as a journalist or a socialite, but as a woman who wanted to be a mother. And there is something about that fact that complicates every easy judgment the viewer might be tempted to make about her. The same woman who was accused of exploiting royal tragedy for profit was simultaneously crossing continents to rescue two children from institutional poverty. The same woman who traded in the secrets of the privileged was building a household for the abandoned. That desire, the desire to mother, to protect, to provide, and was real. It was fierce. It was, by her own account and by the testimony of those who observed her, one of the defining commitments of her life. And it was expensive. Adoption from Russia in the early 1990s required legal fees, travel costs, bureaucratic processing, and the kind of persistent financial outlay that a woman living on a title but without a husband's income could not easily sustain. The boys needed schooling. They needed a home. They needed the material infrastructure of a childhood, and that infrastructure had to come from somewhere. According to her own later accounts and the profiles that discussed it, the need to support her adopted sons was one of the driving forces behind her willingness to write books that she knew would be controversial because controversial books sold, and the money from controversial books was what kept her household running and her children fed. This is where the moral complexity of her story becomes most acute, and where the documentary must resist the temptation to simplify. She was not merely a gossip monger. She was a single mother with two adopted children, living on whatever income she could generate from her name, her contacts, and her willingness to write what others would not. The same impulse that led her to expose the private lives of the royal family, the impulse to turn information into money, was also the impulse that put food on the table for two boys who had been born into a world that had offered them nothing. The viewer must feel both truths simultaneously, the exposé and the motherhood, the ruthlessness and the care, the willingness to sell the secrets of the powerful and the need to provide for the vulnerable. These are not contradictions. They are the texture of a real life, and the script must honor them as such. And then, in 1992, the slow accumulation of the previous decade detonated. Diana in Private was published, and the world Lady Colin Campbell had been preparing to address for years suddenly sat up and paid attention. The book did what no mainstream journalist had yet dared to do in print. It stated plainly that the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales was a catastrophe. It did not hint. It did not hedge. It did not wrap its revelations in the diplomatic language of the broadsheet royal correspondent, the kind of language that said sources close to the couple suggest occasional tensions, when what it meant was that the marriage was a war zone. Lady Colin Campbell named the catastrophe for what it was, and she did so with the bluntness of someone who had no institutional loyalty to protect and nothing left to lose. The book revealed Diana's eating disorder, bulimia, described with a specificity that shocked readers accustomed to the palace's careful management of the princess's public image. It described the separate lives that Charles and Diana were leading, the cold geography of a marriage in which husband and wife occupied the same houses but inhabited different worlds. It named both spouses lovers. It laid bare the emotional warfare, the competing courts within the palace, the loneliness and the rage and the desperate, self destructive coping mechanisms that Diana had developed in response to a marriage that had become a gilded prison. And it suggested, with a directness that was breathtaking for the time, that Diana herself had been the source of many of the leaks and stories that had shaped public perception of the royal marriage, that the princess was not merely a victim of press intrusion, but an active participant in the media war that was tearing the monarchy apart. The timing was extraordinary. The book appeared in a year that would later be described by the Queen herself as an annus horribilis, a year of fire, scandal, separation, and the accelerating disintegration of the Windsor family's public image. Diana in Private was one of the first and loudest detonations in what would become a sustained bombardment. Andrew Morton's Diana. Her true story, which had Diana's covert cooperation, would appear later that same year and would be treated by the establishment and the press alike as the more authoritative account. Morton had the princess's own words, smuggled out of the palace on tape recordings. Lady C had her network, her inferences, and her unshakable confidence in her own analysis. The reaction was immediate, polarized, and fierce. The establishment, the palace, the broadsheets, the royalist commentators who had built their careers on the assumption that the royal marriage was essentially sound, closed ranks. Lady Colin Campbell was dismissed as a fantasist, a troublemaker, an embittered woman with a grudge against the institution that had never embraced her. Her motives were questioned with a ferocity that went well beyond normal literary criticism. Her sources were doubted. Her methodology, if it could be called that, it was picked apart. Her personal history and the old tabloid story about her birth, never fully buried, always available to be exhumed when it was useful, was dragged out again as evidence that she was not to be trusted, that she was, at some fundamental level, not what she appeared to be, and that therefore nothing she wrote could be taken seriously. The establishment's response was not merely to dispute her claims, it was to dispute her right to make them. The message from the world of official royal commentary was clear. This woman does not know what she is talking about, and even if she does, she has no right to say it. She was not Andrew Morton, with his BBC credentials and his newspaper pedigree. She was not a palace correspondent with decades of careful, deferential reporting behind her. She was Lady Colin Campbell, the woman with the scandalous past and the sharp tongue and the title that she had no business still using, and the gatekeepers of royal narrative were not prepared to let her in. But the book sold. It sold enormously. Publishers Weekly recorded it as an 8-week bestseller in cloth. It sold because beneath the establishment's dismissal, there was a public that had been watching the royal marriage with growing unease and growing curiosity, and that recognized in Lady C's account something that felt truer than the official version. She was telling them what they had already suspected. She was confirming what the body language at public engagements had already suggested. And she was doing it with the authority of someone who claimed, and the claim was not entirely baseless, to have been told these things by people who were there. The distinction between what she actually knew, what she had been told by credible sources, and what she had assembled through inference and social intelligence is a distinction that the documentary should acknowledge without pretending it can be definitively resolved. She insisted then and later that her sources were impeccable, that she had been told things directly by people in Diana's orbit. Her critics insisted that she was extrapolating from gossip, embellishing hearsay, and passing off social speculation as insider knowledge. The truth, as it usually does in these matters, likely lies in some complicated middle ground. She knew some things from genuine sources, she inferred other things from her deep understanding of how the royal world operated, and she presented all of it with a confidence that did not always distinguish between the two categories. But here is the fact that her critics could never quite dispose of. Much of what she wrote turned out to be accurate. Not all of it, not every detail. But the broad strokes, the eating disorder, the affairs, the separate lives, the desire for divorce, were confirmed by subsequent events, by Andrew Morton's book later that same year, and by Diana's own extraordinary Panorama interview in 1995, in which the princess looked into a television camera and told the world in her own voice that there had been three people in her marriage. Lady Colin Campbell had told that story first. She had told it without Diana's direct cooperation, without the palace's blessing, and without the protective infrastructure of a major newspaper or broadcasting organization behind her. She had told it as an outsider who had made herself into an insider through decades of social labor, and history, in its slow and partial way, had vindicated her. There is a particular agony in being right too early. The person who sees the truth before the world is ready to accept it does not receive gratitude. They receive contempt. They are called liars, fantasists, troublemakers. They are attacked not for being wrong, but for being premature, for breaking the consensus before the consensus is ready to break. Lady Colin Campbell experienced that agony in full. She had published the truth about the royal marriage in 1992, and the establishment had spent the following years insisting she was fabricating. When the same truth emerged from other, more respectable sources, the establishment did not circle back to Lady C and acknowledge that she had been right all along. It simply absorbed the truths into the mainstream narrative and continued to treat her as an unreliable outsider. That experience of being simultaneously vindicated and dismissed would become one of the defining emotional textures of the rest of her life. She would never stop insisting that she had been right, and the world would never quite give her the credit she believed she deserved. That vindication was never complete. It was never acknowledged by the establishment. It was never accompanied by an apology from the commentators who had dismissed her. And it was complicated by the fact that some of her later claims would prove more contentious, more difficult to verify, and more open to the charge that she was stretching her credibility beyond what her sources could support. But in 1992, with Diana in private selling in quantities that made publishers sit up and literary agents return her calls, Lady Colin Campbell had achieved something remarkable. She had turned the most painful lessons of her own life, the lessons about privacy, exposure, the gap between surface and reality, the weaponization of intimate information, into a career. The paths now diverged with an almost geometrical clarity that the documentary should render visually as well as narratively. Lord Colin Campbell receded from public life. His thread in this story grows thinner after the divorce, not because he ceased to exist, but because the energy of the narrative had shifted irrevocably to the woman who bore his name. He remained a Campbell. He remained a son of the 11th Duke. He lived his life in whatever manner the reduced circumstances of a younger son and the accumulated weight of the family reputation permitted. But the title Lord Colin Campbell would never carry the cultural weight that Lady Colin Campbell was accumulating with every book, every interview, every appearance on a television program where she was introduced as the woman who knew the royal secrets. He had given her his name in a 5-day courtship, and she had made it more famous than he could ever have imagined, or perhaps than he could comfortably bear. The younger son of the scandal-haunted duke had been overtaken by the ex-wife he had tried to destroy, and there is something in that reversal that speaks to one of the deepest themes of this story. The assumption, held by men of his class and background, that they could use women and discard them, and the discovery, in Lady C's case, that the discarded woman had more staying power than the man who had done the discarding. She, meanwhile, was becoming something that the British cultural landscape had not quite seen before. An aristocratic outsider-insider who specialized in royal exposé. She was not a journalist. She had no training in the craft, no editor to answer to, no institutional code of ethics governing her methods. She was not a courtier. She held no position within the royal household, owed no loyalty to the crown, answered to no palace official who could call her in and demand an explanation. She was not a relative of the royal family. She had no blood connection to them and no dynastic obligation to protect their interests. She was something entirely new, a titled woman with social access, a scandalous past that had taught her exactly how the system worked, a sharp pen, and an apparently inexhaustible willingness to write things that other people in her social world only whispered over drinks. The title that Lord Colin had given her was now the platform from which she lobbed grenades at his world. The irony would have been delicious if it had not also been, in its own way, profoundly melancholy. A reminder that the marriage, for all its brevity and all its pain, had permanently altered both their lives, and that the woman had emerged from the wreckage stronger than the man. And her boys were growing. Misha and Dima were establishing themselves in the life she was building. A life funded by royalties, by social connections, by the relentless conversion of insider knowledge into published prose. She was a mother now, with all the ferocity and all the vulnerability that motherhood implies, and the boys gave her story a dimension that pure ambition could never have provided. When she sat down to write about Diana's pain, about the loneliness of a woman trapped in a loveless royal marriage, she was not writing from a position of mere professional interest. She was writing as a woman who had herself been trapped, who had herself been publicly humiliated by a husband, who had herself fought for custody of a narrative that others wanted to control. The empathy in her writing, and there was empathy beneath the sharp edges and the commercial calculation, came from a place that was genuinely personal. But empathy and exploitation can coexist. They can live in the same paragraph, the same sentence, the same breath. Lady Colin Campbell felt for Diana. She also profited from Diana. She understood Diana's suffering because she had experienced something structurally similar. A woman married into a powerful institution, publicly humiliated by a husband, stripped of privacy, forced to fight for control of her own story. She also monetized Diana's suffering because that was what the market demanded, and because she had two boys and a lifestyle to support, and because the alternatives, silence, respectability, the slow disappearance into the kind of genteel poverty that afflicts titled women without independent means, was not something she was prepared to accept. The documentary must hold both of these truths without flinching, because the moment it collapses into either pure sympathy or pure condemnation, it loses the thing that makes this story worth telling. The irreducible complexity of a woman who was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, insider and outsider, truth teller and opportunist, devoted mother and ruthless operator. By the early 1990s, the transformation was complete. The woman who had entered a failed marriage seeking shelter had become one of the most feared names in royal publishing. The woman who had been exposed by the tabloids was now the one doing the exposing. The woman whose private body had been made into a public scandal was now making a living from the private lives of the most public family in the world. The title she had kept out of defiance had become a brand worth more than the marriage had ever been. And then, on the 31st of August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in a Paris tunnel. She was 36 years old. She had been the most photographed, most discussed, most mythologized woman in the world. And she was gone. The shock that moved through Britain in the days that followed was unlike anything the country had experienced in living memory. It was not merely grief, though grief was part of it. It was something closer to a national reckoning, a sudden, visceral confrontation with the consequences of the very machinery that had sustained public fascination with Diana for 16 years. The press that had pursued her, the public that had consumed her, the institutions that had failed her, the industry of royal commentary that had turned her marriage, her suffering, her body, her motherhood, and her love affairs into an inexhaustible source of content. All of it, and the entire apparatus of Diana as spectacle, was suddenly forced to look at itself in the mirror of a Paris underpass, and the reflection was devastating. For Lady Colin Campbell, the death changed everything. It changed the moral temperature of her entire world overnight. The market for royal intimacy, which had sustained her career for half a decade, was suddenly not merely controversial, but radioactive. The public that had bought her books about Diana's private anguish was now weeping in the streets, leaving flowers at palace gates, demanding to know who was to blame. The question of who had the right to tell Diana's story, and who had been profiting from it, and at what cost and with what justification, became one of the most charged and unforgiving questions in British public life. Lady Colin Campbell had proved she could sell the secrets of a troubled princess. She had proved she could navigate the treacherous waters of royal expose with commercial success and social audacity. She had proved that the lessons of her own humiliation could be turned into a career of extraordinary reach. Now she would have to decide what it meant to sell the secrets of a dead one. And that decision, how she handled it, what she wrote, what she claimed, and what it cost her, would determine whether the third house she was building, the house of Lady C, would survive its most dangerous test. She did not hesitate. That is the first thing to understand about what happened next. Whatever private reckoning Lady Colin Campbell may have undergone in the days and weeks after Diana's death, and she was a human being, so there must have been some reckoning, some moment of stillness in which the magnitude of what had happened and what it meant for her own life pressed itself upon her. The public record shows no hesitation. The market for Diana had not died with Diana. If anything, it had intensified. The princess's death had created a void so vast that the entire publishing industry, the entire media landscape, the entire apparatus of royal commentary rushed to fill it. Books were commissioned, documentaries were planned, retrospectives were assembled, conspiracy theories began to germinate in the damp, fertile soil of public grief and institutional distrust. And Lady Colin Campbell, who had been writing about Diana's private life for half a decade, who had built her reputation and her income on the claim that she knew things about the princess that others did not, was not about to step back from the market she had helped to create. The cultural landscape that surrounded Diana's death was unlike anything Britain had experienced. The flowers outside Kensington Palace, the silence that fell over central London in the days before the funeral, the extraordinary, almost frightening intensity of public emotion, the weeping strangers, the handwritten notes pinned to gates and fences and walls, the candles flickering in the late summer darkness, the sense that something had broken in the national psyche and that nobody quite knew how to mend it. The grief was real. It was also, in ways that would become clearer with time, performative, a collective act of mourning that said as much about the public's relationship with celebrity, with the press, with the monarchy, and with its own emotional needs as it said about Diana herself. The princess had been many things to many people, and in death she became all of those things simultaneously. Victim, saint, rebel, mother, beauty, martyr. The complexity of her actual life, the eating disorder, the affairs, the manipulation of the press, the genuine compassion for the sick and the marginalized, the desperation of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, the courage of a woman who had looked into a television camera and told the truth, was flattened into a simpler and more usable myth, and that myth was enormously, almost obscenely commercially viable. The publishing industry understood this immediately. Within weeks of the funeral, every major house in London and New York was commissioning Diana books. Former staff members were approached. Former friends were courted. Journalists who had covered the royal beat were offered advances that bore no relationship to their normal earning capacity. The race was on to produce the definitive posthumous account, and the competitors were numerous. Andrew Morton, who had Diana's own cooperation for his earlier book and now had the authority of prior access. Patrick Jeffson, her former private secretary, who had the authority of institutional proximity, and a cascade of lesser figures, former bodyguards, former dressers, former school friends, former lovers, all scrambling to convert their proximity to Diana into published pages before the grief market cooled. Lady Colin Campbell understood this market better than most because she had spent her career operating in the space between the myth and the reality. She knew that the public's appetite for Diana was not diminished by death, it was transformed by it. When Diana was alive, the appetite had been for gossip, for scandal, for the delicious frisson of knowing what the princess was really like behind closed doors. Was she happy? Was she miserable? Was she having an affair? Was she losing weight? Was she fighting with Charles? Was she breaking free or was she trapped? The appetite had been entertaining, prurient, and essentially trivial. Now that she was dead, the appetite had shifted. It was for truth, for meaning, for the definitive account that would explain what had really happened and why and whether it could have been prevented. The market was not smaller, it was different. And it was, if anything, more lucrative than the gossip market had been, because the stakes had been raised from entertainment to legacy, from titillation to history. And the public was willing to pay premium prices for anyone who could credibly claim to have the inside story of what had really gone wrong. The question that hung over everything Lady C did in the months after Diana's death was a question that the documentary must pose directly, because it is the question on which her entire moral legacy depends. Did she have the right? It is a question that demands more than a simple answer, because it contains within it several different questions, each with its own moral weight. Did she have the right to continue writing about a woman who was no longer alive to respond, to correct, to object, to tell her own side of the story? The answer, legally, was yes. The dead cannot be libeled. And the publishing of biographical accounts of deceased public figures is a protected activity in every jurisdiction that values freedom of expression. But the legal right and the moral right are not the same thing, and the moral question was far more troubling. Did she have the right to profit from the grief of a nation? To turn the raw material of collective mourning into a commercial product? To sell books in a marketplace that existed only because a young mother had died in a car crash? Did she have the right to trade on insider knowledge that had been acquired through social networks built on discretion, on trust, on the unspoken compact that certain things would be handled with sensitivity, and to do so at the very moment when the nation was still weeping, still laying flowers, still trying to make sense of a loss that felt, to millions of people, deeply and personally devastating? And beneath all of these questions lay a deeper one still, a question that applied not just to Lady Colin Campbell, but to every journalist, every biographer, every commentator, every publisher, and every member of the public who had ever consumed a story about Diana's private life. At what point does the appetite for truth become indistinguishable from the appetite for spectacle? At what point does the reader's desire to know what really happened merge with the reader's desire to be entertained by someone else's suffering? These were not new questions. They had hung over the Diana story from the beginning, from the very first tabloid photograph of a 19-year-old nursery worker looking startled in the lens of a telephoto camera. But Diana's death made them urgent in a way they had never been before, because the death itself, the car chase, the paparazzi, the tunnel, seemed to be the ultimate consequence of the very machinery of exposure that had sustained the public's fascination for 16 years. The answer Lady Colin Campbell gave, through her actions, was unequivocal. She had the right because she had the knowledge and the nerve to use it. She had the right because she had been telling the truth before anyone else was willing to. She had the right because the story she had to tell was more complete, more honest, and more respectful of Diana's actual humanity than the sanitized myth that the establishment was trying to impose. Whether the viewer accepts that answer is a matter for the viewer's own conscience. The documentary's job is not to deliver a verdict, it is to show what happened and let the weight of the facts do the work. What happened was the real Diana. The book first appeared in 1998, approximately 1 year after Diana's death. It was published by Macmillan, a name that carried weight, that carried respectability, that signaled to the reading public that this was not a hastily assembled cash-in, but a serious work of biographical inquiry. The distinction mattered because the publishing landscape in the year after Diana's death was littered with books of wildly varying quality, from carefully researched accounts by respected journalists to thinly sourced potboilers by people whose proximity to Diana had consisted of standing in the same room as her at a charity function. Lady C's book arrived with the imprimatur of a major publisher, and it arrived with the accumulated authority of a woman who had been writing about Diana for 6 years, and who could claim, with at least some justification, that history had proved her right. It arrived, too, in a marketplace that was beginning to sour. The initial frenzy of posthumous publishing was giving way to something more complicated, a public that was still grieving, but also beginning to feel uncomfortable about the grief industry that had sprung up around Diana's memory. The flowers at Kensington Palace had wilted, the candles had gone out, the handwritten notes had been collected and archived, and the public, which had spent September 1997 in a state of collective emotional intensity that some commentators compared to a national nervous breakdown, was beginning to ask itself awkward questions about the nature of its own response. Had the grief been genuine? Had it been manipulated? Had the press, having pursued Diana to her death, now pivoted seamlessly to profiting from the mourning? And were the people buying Diana books, people like Lady Colin Campbell's readers, complicit in the very machinery of exploitation that had destroyed the princess? Into this morally charged atmosphere, the real Diana dropped like a stone into still water. The title alone was a provocation. The real Diana, not the myth, not the saint, not the victim, the real woman. The claim embedded in those 3 words was extraordinary in its audacity. It said, in effect, I knew her. I knew the truth about her. And what I am about to tell you is more real, more authentic, more faithful to the actual Diana than anything you have read in the flood of posthumous tributes and tear-stained hagiographies. It was a claim that depended entirely on the reader's willingness to believe that Lady Colin Campbell, a woman who had never been part of Diana's inner circle, who had never been a confidant in the way that Diana's close friends had been, who had assembled her knowledge through a network of intermediaries rather than through direct personal relationship, was nevertheless a more reliable narrator of Diana's life than anyone else on the market. The book itself contained revelations that went further than Diana in private had gone. Later editions and updated afterwards would add fresh material, including interviews and theories about the circumstances of Diana's death that ventured into territory more speculative than her earlier work. The Macmillan summary of the book stated that Campbell revealed Diana herself had been the source of much of the information in her earlier books, a claim that, if true, fundamentally altered the moral calculus of everything she had published. If Diana had been a willing, even eager participant in the leaking of her own private life, then Lady C was not merely an exploiter of royal tragedy. She was a channel, a conduit through which the princess had chosen to communicate truths that she could not say directly, truths that the institution of the monarchy was determined to suppress. Whether this claim was accurate, partially accurate, or self-serving is a question that the documentary must acknowledge without pretending to resolve. Diana was dead. She could not confirm or deny. The sources who might have corroborated the claim were either silent, anonymous, or compromised by their own interests. What the documentary can say, with confidence, is that the claim served Lady C's interest perfectly. It transformed her from a gossip seller into a truth teller. It made her not the villain of the Diana story, but its faithful servant. The woman who had done what Diana herself had wanted at Diana's own request, and who was now continuing that work in the princess's memory. It was a narrative of remarkable convenience. It was also possibly true. And the impossibility of ever knowing for certain is part of what makes this story so resistant to easy moral judgment. The publication of The Real Diana was the moment that crystallized the central tension of Lady Colin Campbell's public life into its sharpest and most uncomfortable form. Here was a woman who had been born into a lie, registered as the wrong sex, raised as the wrong person, forced to fight for the most basic recognition of who she actually was. Here was a woman who had been publicly humiliated by a husband who sold false stories about her body to the British press. Here was a woman who had built a career on the claim that she could see through the lies that powerful institutions told about themselves, that she understood from the inside the gap between the public version and the private reality. And here she was, less than a year after the death of the most famous woman in the world, publishing a book that claimed to reveal the real Diana, a Diana that the public had never been allowed to see, a Diana that the palace had spent years trying to suppress, a Diana that only Lady Colin Campbell, with her unique combination of social access and moral fearlessness, was equipped to present. There was a kind of terrible symmetry to it. The woman who had been falsely exposed now made her living through exposure. The woman whose body had been turned into tabloid fodder now turned other people's private lives into best-selling books. The woman who had fought for the right to control her own narrative now exercised an unaccountable power over the narratives of others. She was not unaware of this symmetry. She was too intelligent, too self-aware, and too thoroughly schooled in the dynamics of public life to miss it. But she had decided, and this was the decision that defined her more than any single book or any single revelation, that the world owed her nothing, that the institutions she had passed through had taught her that sentiment was weakness, and that if she did not tell the story, someone else would tell it less accurately and pocket the money that she and her children needed. The moral question at the heart of that moment is not whether Lady C was right about the facts. Some of her facts were right, some were contested, some would be corroborated by later accounts, others would remain in the disputed territory where royal biography always lives, because the sources are anonymous, the principles are dead or silent, and the truth is a mosaic assembled from fragments that never quite form a complete picture. The moral question is deeper than factual accuracy. It is this: what does it mean to build a career, a brand, an identity, and a livelihood on the private suffering of someone who can no longer consent to the telling? The documentary should not attempt to answer that question with a thesis statement or a moral pronouncement. It should answer it by showing the viewer the human reality on both sides, and by trusting the viewer to sit inside the discomfort without being told what to feel. On one side, Lady Colin Campbell, a mother of 2 adopted sons, a woman who had been publicly broken and had rebuilt herself through sheer force of will, sitting at a desk in a London flat and writing about a dead princess, because that was the skill she had and the market she had built, and the only way she knew to keep the household running, and the boys in school and the rent paid and the life she had constructed from the wreckage of other people's cruelty still standing. She was not writing from a position of comfort. She was writing from a position of necessity, the necessity of a woman who had no husband, No family money, no institutional salary, and no safety net beyond her own talent for turning private knowledge into public prose. On the other side, the memory of Diana, a woman who had been consumed by the very machinery of public exposure that Lady C had learned to operate with such devastating efficiency. A woman whose private agony, the bulimia, the self-harm, the loneliness, the desperate late-night telephone calls, had been turned into a national entertainment while she was alive and a national industry after she was dead. A woman who had tried, in the last years of her life, to reclaim some measure of privacy and some measure of control over her own story, and who had been denied both by a press that would not stop watching and a public that would not stop wanting to know. Diana had been the most exposed woman in the history of the British monarchy, and now in death she was being exposed all over again by books like Lady C's, by documentaries, by retrospectives, by the entire vast apparatus of Diana remembrance that showed no sign of slowing down. Between those two human realities, there is no comfortable position. There is no moral high ground that does not crumble the moment you examine it closely. There is only the uncomfortable truth that the machinery of fame, of scandal, of royal mythology does not stop when someone dies. It accelerates, and the people who know how to operate it, and people like Lady Colin Campbell, find themselves in a position of extraordinary power and extraordinary moral exposure. They can tell the story, they can profit from the story, they can even believe with genuine conviction that they are serving the truth. But they cannot escape the fact that the story they are telling belongs, in some fundamental sense, to someone who is no longer here to object. The public reception of the real Diana split along exactly the lines that the reception of Diana in private had split, but with the intensity amplified by grief and by the moral weight of writing about the dead. Some readers credited her contacts, her insight, her willingness to say what others would not. They believed she had known Diana, or known people who knew Diana, and that the portrait she painted was closer to the truth than the airbrushed version the palace preferred. They read the book as an act of loyalty to Diana's memory. The argument being that Diana, who had spent her marriage fighting against the palace's version of her life, would have wanted the truth told, and that Lady C was honoring that wish. Others were repelled. They saw her as a vulture, a woman who had circled the dying marriage for years and who was now feeding on the corpse. They saw the timing as mercenary, the claims as unverifiable, and the entire enterprise as a cynical exercise in converting a dead woman's name into cash. The word exploitation appeared in reviews and opinion pieces with a frequency that would have been devastating to a less resilient person. But Lady Colin Campbell was, by this point in her life, one of the most resilient people in British public life. She had been called worse. She had survived worse. She had been publicly accused of being a man. She had been beaten by her own account by a husband. She had fought libel battles in the courts. She had endured the systematic contempt of an establishment that had never wanted her and that had spent 2 decades wishing she would go away. A few hostile book reviews were not going to break her. The polarity of the response was not incidental to her success. It was her market position. She existed, commercially and culturally, in the space between insider and outsider, between authority and notoriety, between respect and contempt. That space was uncomfortable, but it was also, in its own peculiar way, unassailable. She could not be dismissed as someone who knew nothing. She clearly knew something, and enough of what she had previously said had proved accurate to make blanket dismissal look like intellectual dishonesty or institutional self-protection. But she could not be embraced as a trusted authority either, because her methods were opaque. Her motives were mixed, her personal history made her easy to caricature, and the question of whether she was primarily a truth teller or primarily a profiteer was one that reasonable people could answer differently depending on which parts of the story they chose to emphasize. She occupied the exact position in the British media landscape that the British media landscape is least equipped to deal with. The position of the person who is probably partly right, who is definitely making money from being right, and who is absolutely not going away. In the months and years after the real Diana, the pattern continued. The royal marriages had already established her as a serial royal biographer. Now the Diana books cemented the brand. She was Lady C, the woman who knew, the woman who told, the woman who lived in the space between the palace and the public and who made her living translating the secrets of the one into the language of the other. Each new book attracted the same cycle of outrage and fascination. Each new claim provoked the same split between believers and skeptics. and each new publication demonstrated that the market for royal intimacy, far from being exhausted by Diana's death, had been permanently enlarged by it. Diana had changed the rules. She had made the private lives of the royals a matter of permanent, insatiable public interest. And Lady Colin Campbell had positioned herself, through years of preparation and through the accident of having been right at the right time, as one of the primary suppliers of that interest. The immediate aftermath of the Diana publishing era was a period of consolidation rather than transformation. Lady C did not stop writing. She did not retreat into the private life that the establishment had always wished she would adopt. She did not undergo a public crisis of conscience. Or if she did, she kept it private, which would have been entirely consistent with a lifetime spent controlling which parts of her interior life the world was permitted to see. She continued to publish on the royal family. Work on the Queen Mother followed. Later, books on the monarchy's response to Harry and Meghan would extend the brand into the 21st century. The subjects changed, but the method remained the same. Insider knowledge, social access, a willingness to write what others whispered, and the unapologetic deployment of the title Lady Colin Campbell as the guarantee of authority. She continued to appear on television, where her sharp tongue and her theatrical delivery made her a reliable booking for any program that needed a provocative voice on royal matters. She was not the kind of guest who delivered measured diplomatic analysis. She was the kind of guest who said things that made producers nervous and audiences pay attention. The camera loved her, or at least found her compulsive. The combination of title and transgression, of aristocratic manner and tabloid content, was irresistible to programmers who understood that controversy was ratings and that Lady Colin Campbell was reliably and predictably controversial. She continued to maintain the social network that had fed her career for decades. The dinners, the lunches, the telephone calls, the careful cultivation of sources and contacts and friends of friends who might, at any moment, deliver the next fragment of insider information that would become the next revelation in the next book. The network was her infrastructure. Without it, she was merely a titled woman with opinions. With it, she was Lady C, the woman who knew. The boys were growing up. Misha and Dima were becoming young men, moving through the world that their mother had built for them, with whatever mixture of pride and bewilderment the children of extraordinary parents always carry. They had been rescued from Russian orphanages and raised in a household funded by royal biography, maintained by social audacity, and presided over by a woman whose public persona was so large and so vivid that it must at times have been difficult to see the private mother behind it, whether they fully understood the moral complexity of how their household had been sustained. The secrets sold, the reputations traded, the careful conversion of private grief into public copy is something the documentary cannot know. What it can know is that they existed, that they were loved, and that their presence in her life gave the entire Lady C enterprise a human dimension that pure ambition could never have provided. And the brand Lady Colin Campbell, a brand that a 5-day marriage had created and that half a century of scandal, litigation, authorship, and public combat had made indelible, continued to appreciate in value with every passing year, every new book, every television appearance, every headline. But something had shifted. The Diana books had taken her as far as royal biography could take her. She had written the story of the most famous woman in the world, and the world had paid attention, and the world had argued about whether she was right, and the argument had never been fully resolved, and the books had sold, and the money had come in, and the boys had been fed and schooled and raised. She had survived. She had more than survived. She had built from the wreckage of a 9-month marriage and a tabloid humiliation that would have destroyed most people, a career that the social world, which had tried to discard her, could not have imagined and could not ignore. But she was in her 50s now, and the publishing landscape was shifting, and the world was moving on to new obsessions. And the question that confronts every person who has built a life on reinvention is always the same. What comes next? She had remade herself once, from George William to Georgia Ariana. She had remade herself again, from discarded wife to feared biographer. Each reinvention had been an act of will so fierce that it had altered the landscape around her. And now, with the Diana era behind her and the future uncertain, she was contemplating a third reinvention, one that would be stranger and more ambitious and more literal than anything that had come before. She was going to build a house, not a metaphorical house, not merely a brand, though that too, an actual physical stone and mortar house, A castle, in fact, a grade 2 listed Regency Gothic castle on the Sussex coast, with leaking roofs and crumbling stonework and the kind of restoration bill that would make a lottery winner flinch. A castle that would become the architectural expression of the dynasty she had constructed after the dynasties of her birth and her marriage had failed her. A castle that would be her home, her stage, her monument, and her final answer to every person and every institution that had ever told her she did not belong. Castle Goring was waiting. It had been waiting for decades, falling gently into disrepair, its grand rooms empty, its gardens overgrown, its future uncertain. It did not know that the most improbable chatelaine in English history was about to walk through its doors, and the strangest, most audacious chapter of the Lady Colin Campbell story was about to begin. She found Castle Goring in the way that people who are destined for a certain kind of life find the thing that completes their mythology, not by accident and not entirely by design, but through the convergence of appetite, circumstance, and the peculiar instinct that certain people possess for recognizing the stage on which they were always meant to perform. The castle sits near Worthing, on the Sussex coast, not in the heart of aristocratic England, but at its edge, which was appropriate for a woman who had spent her entire life operating at the edge of the world she claimed to inhabit. It is a grade 2 listed building, designed in the early 19th century in the Regency Gothic style, with a front elevation that looks like something from a romantic novel, and a rear elevation in the Palladian style that creates the architectural equivalent of a double life, one face for the world, another for those who see it from behind. If Lady Colin Campbell had commissioned a building to serve as a metaphor for her own existence, she could not have done better than Castle Goring. She purchased it in 2013 or 2014. Public sources vary slightly on the exact date, and from the moment she took possession, the castle became inseparable from her public identity. It was, in one sense, simply a house. A large, crumbling, prohibitively expensive house that needed new roofing and new plumbing and new wiring, and the kind of comprehensive structural restoration that would make a conservation architect weep with either excitement or despair, depending on who was paying the bills. The scale of the task was daunting. This was not a house that needed a fresh coat of paint and some new curtains. This was a building that had been slipping, slowly and inexorably, towards dereliction for years. A building whose fabric had been compromised by decades of insufficient maintenance, whose grand rooms echoed with the particular emptiness of spaces that had once been magnificent and were now merely large and cold and damp. The roof let in water. The walls were cracked. The gardens had gone wild. The entire structure seemed to be engaged in a slow, dignified surrender to the forces of gravity, weather, and neglect. And she looked at it, and she saw herself. That sounds like sentimentality, but it is something more precise than that. Castle Goring was a building that had been built to impress, designed to present one face to the world while hiding another, constructed with ambition that outstripped its resources, beautiful and fragile and stubbornly still standing, despite every reason it had to fall down. If Lady Colin Campbell had commissioned a building to serve as a metaphor for her own existence, she could not have done better than this. The Regency Gothic front, all turrets and pointed arches and romantic aspiration, was the public face. The face she showed the world, the title and the books and the television appearances and the unapologetic theatrical confidence. The Palladian rear, classical and restrained and built on different principles entirely, was the private self. The Jamaican childhood, the surgical correction, the motherhood, the vulnerability she rarely let anyone see. But it was also something far more significant than a metaphor. It was a statement. It was the physical, architectural, unmistakable declaration that Lady Colin Campbell, the girl from Jamaica who had been registered as a boy, the ex-wife who had been humiliated in the tabloids, the outsider who had forced her way into the British establishment and then spent decades telling its secrets, had arrived. Not temporarily, not as a guest, not as a visitor tolerated on sufferance, but as a proprietor, as a chatelaine, as the owner of a castle. The irony was layered and deliberate. She had married into the House of Campbell, which had a castle, Inverary, one of the great seats of the Scottish aristocracy. And the marriage had lasted 9 months and ended in public ruin. Now she had acquired a castle of her own, not through marriage, but through purchase. Not through the gift of a man, but through the earnings of her own pen and her own nerve. The House of ZD had given her a childhood of concealment. The House of Campbell had given her a title and a scandal. The House of Lady C, the third house, the self-made house, now had a physical address, a set of turrets, and a restoration budget that would keep her working for the rest of her life. The funding of that restoration became a story in itself. Lady Colin Campbell did not have the kind of money that castle restoration demands. The hundreds of thousands, the millions that vanish into ancient stonework and leaking roofs and the endlessly hungry fabric of a listed building that English heritage expects to be maintained to standards that have no relationship to the financial reality of the person doing the maintaining. She needed income. She needed it urgently and in quantities that book royalties alone could not supply. And so she turned with the pragmatic shamelessness that had defined her entire career, to television. Reality television, specifically, the format that the British cultural establishment regards with a mixture of fascination and contempt. The same mixture, in fact, with which it had always regarded Lady Colin Campbell herself. She appeared on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, in 2015 at the age of 66, submitting herself to the indignities of the Australian jungle with the same theatrical determination she had brought to every other arena of public life. The decision to appear was itself a kind of revelation. Here was a woman who had spent decades cultivating an image of aristocratic authority, of insider knowledge, of proximity to the highest echelons of British society, and she was willing to eat insects on camera and sleep in a hammock and argue with minor celebrities about washing up duty, all because the castle needed a new roof and the castle was more important than her dignity. She was not the kind of contestant who melted into the background. She was the kind of contestant who provoked confrontation, who refused to be patronized, who treated the entire exercise as a performance in which she was simultaneously the star and the audience and the critic. She clashed with fellow contestants. She held court. She displayed a combination of imperious self-assurance and genuine physical discomfort that made for compelling and occasionally excruciating television. The British public, watching from their sofas, saw a version of Lady Colin Campbell that the royal biographies had never quite revealed. A woman who was simultaneously tougher and more fragile than her public persona suggested. A woman who could face down a bush tucker trial with the same composure she brought to a libel hearing, and who could also, in unguarded moments, look every one of her 66 years and every mile of the journey that had brought her from a Jamaican nursery to an Australian jungle. The public response was predictably divided. Some viewers found her magnificent, a woman of indomitable spirit who refused to be diminished by circumstance or by age. Others found her insufferable, a woman whose sense of her own importance was comically disproportionate to the setting. Both responses served her purposes equally, because both kept her name in the public conversation and both generated the kind of sustained media attention that could be converted eventually into the resources she needed for the castle. The castle itself became the subject of its own documentary. Lady C and the Castle, which aired in 2016, followed the restoration process and gave the public a version of Lady Colin Campbell that was both more sympathetic and more revealing than anything her royal biographies had offered. Here was a woman in her mid-60s, living in a building that was literally falling apart around her, arguing with builders about timelines, fretting about budgets that seemed to expand with every passing week, negotiating with heritage authorities about what could be changed and what had to be preserved, and displaying a combination of grandiose ambition and genuine domestic vulnerability that made for compelling and occasionally moving viewing. The leaking roof was not a metaphor, it was a real roof, and the water coming through it was real water, and the buckets placed beneath the worst drips were real buckets. The damp patches on the walls were not atmospheric set dressing. They were the visible evidence of a building that was slowly losing its battle with the English climate, and of a woman who had decided, with the same obstinate determination that had characterized every major decision of her life, that she was going to win that battle, even if it cost her every penny she had, even if it meant eating insects on reality television, even if it meant opening her home to cameras and strangers and the kind of public scrutiny that most people would find intolerable. The woman standing in the entrance hall with a telephone in one hand and an expression of furious determination on her face was a woman who had decided that this castle, her castle, not the Campbell's castle, not anyone else's castle, was going to survive and that she was going to be the one to save it. There was something deeply moving about the spectacle if you were willing to look past the theatricality and see the human being underneath. This was a woman who had spent her childhood in a house where appearances mattered more than truth. She had spent her brief marriage in a family whose great house, Inverary Castle, had been the backdrop to some of the most spectacular domestic disasters in British aristocratic history. And now she was pouring her money, her energy, and her remaining years into the restoration of a house that she had chosen, a house that owed its survival not to inheritance or to dynasty, but to the earnings of a woman who had made herself from nothing and who was determined to leave something behind. The restoration was not merely practical, it was symbolic in a way that the documentary made explicit and that the viewer could hardly miss. Every replaced tile, every repointed wall, every room brought back from dereliction to habitable condition was an act of self authorship on a monumental scale. The castle was the one claim Lady Colin Campbell made about herself that was entirely beyond dispute. She had taken something that was falling apart and she had put it back together. That was when you stripped away the titles and the books and the television appearances and the decades of controversy, the simplest and most accurate description of her life. The three houses of her saga now stood in clear relationship to each other. The House of Ziadie, the Jamaican mercantile family that had valued appearance over truth and had registered a girl as a boy because the appearance of a boy was less threatening to the family's coherence, had given her the wound. The House of Campbell, the Scottish aristocratic dynasty that had consumed her, exposed her, and spat her out, had given her the education. And the House of Lady C, Castle Goring, the YouTube channel, the books, the brand, the hard-won and permanently contested public identity, was the answer she had built from both. Through the years that followed, the Lady C brand continued to evolve with a restlessness that would have exhausted a woman half her age. The royal biographies continued, work on the Queen Mother, later books addressing the Harry and Meghan saga, and the seismic shifts in the Windsor family's public image, each one generating the same reliable cycle of controversy, dismissal, and commercial success that had sustained her career since 1992. The subjects changed as the monarchy changed. The Windsors of the 21st century provided an apparently inexhaustible supply of material. The marriage of William and Catherine, the courtship and marriage and departure of Harry and Meghan, the death of the Queen, the accession of Charles, the endless recursive drama of a family that had lost its capacity for privacy and gained, in return, a permanent place at the center of the global entertainment industry. And Lady Colin Campbell, who had understood the transformation of the monarchy from an institution that demanded deference into an institution that generated content, before most people had even noticed it was happening, continued to position herself as one of its chief narrators and most provocative interpreters. The Harry and Meghan books, in particular, demonstrated that her appetite for royal controversy had not diminished with age. The departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex from the working royal family, and the public accusations and counter-accusations that accompanied it, gave Lady C a new generation of subjects and a new set of fault lines to exploit. She weighed in with her customary directness, taking positions that delighted some readers and infuriated others, maintaining her brand identity as the woman who would say what the palace could not and what polite commentators would not. Her public persona migrated too with the shifting landscape of media. The books remained, but alongside them grew a digital presence that would have been unimaginable to the woman who had published Diana in private in the age of hardback and broadsheet review. Her official YouTube channel became a one-woman broadcasting operation. Regular uploads of royal commentary delivered directly to camera with the same combination of insider authority and outsider audacity that had always been her signature. The channel bypassed the traditional gatekeepers entirely. She no longer needed a publisher to approve her claims. She no longer needed a television producer to book her as a guest. She could speak directly to her audience, in her own voice, on her own schedule, and the audience responded. The channel was still active in April 2026, with new uploads continuing and a substantial back catalog of videos that together constituted the kind of running oral history of Lady C's view of the monarchy. The technology had changed, the medium had changed, the economics of media had changed beyond all recognition. The woman had not. The Argyle world she had briefly inhabited also experienced its own cultural afterlife, though not through her efforts. In 2021, the BBC aired a very British scandal, a dramatization of the Argyle divorce case that had convulsed Britain in the 1960s, the same divorce whose toxic aftermath had shaped the household into which Georgia Ziadie had married a decade later. The series, starring Claire Foy as Margaret, Duchess of Argyle, brought the story of the headless man photographs and the judicial destruction of Margaret's reputation to a new generation of viewers who had never heard of the case and who were, by all accounts, shocked by the systematic cruelty with which the legal system had been used to annihilate a woman's reputation. The series was critically acclaimed. It was widely discussed, and it was, in a sense, the prequel to Lady C's own story, the tale of the first woman who had been broken by the Argyle name, told with the sympathy and the feminist consciousness that the original courts had conspicuously lacked. Watching it, and it is impossible to believe that Lady Colin Campbell did not watch it, or at least absorb its cultural impact, one could not help but see the pattern with devastating clarity. The same family, the same machinery of intimate destruction, the same willingness to turn a woman's private life into a public weapon, the same assumption that the man's reputation was worth protecting and the woman's was not. What had happened to Margaret in the 1960s and what had happened to Georgia in the 1970s were not separate stories. They were the same story, told twice, by the same family, using the same methods, with the same contempt for the women involved. The only difference was the ending. Margaret had been destroyed. Georgia had survived. And the survival had been achieved not through the system's protection, but through the system's education. The harsh, comprehensive, irreversible education in how power works that the Argyle family had inadvertently provided. Lady C herself was not a character in a very British scandal. Her marriage to Lord Colin came too late in the Argyle timeline for the drama to include it. But her ghost haunted the series nonetheless, because the story it told was the story that had made her possible, the story of what the House of Argyle did to the women who entered it and of what one of those women did in return. Lady Colin Campbell is 76 years old now. She divides her time, according to her official website, between London and Castle Goring, between the city that first received her as a title-seeking bride and humiliated her in its tabloids, and the castle on the Sussex coast that she bought with the earnings of the career that humiliation made possible. The castle is an operating venue, available for events, for filming, for weddings and gatherings, and the kind of commercial activity that keeps a listed building alive in an era when private wealth alone can rarely sustain the costs of conservation. It is not merely her home. It is her business, her brand, her stage, and her legacy. When she is gone, Castle Goring will remain. The physical proof that a woman with no inheritance, and no husband, and no institutional support built something that will outlast her. She maintains her public presence with a discipline that has not wavered in 50 years. The YouTube channel continues. The commentary continues. The opinions continue. Sharp, theatrical, unapologetic, delivered with the vocal authority of a woman who has spent a lifetime refusing to be silenced and who sees no reason to begin now. She still commands a room. She still makes headlines. She still provokes the same divided response that she has provoked since the 1970s. Admiration from those who see her as a survivor and a truth teller. Contempt from those who see her as an opportunist and a gossip, and from most people, some unstable, shifting mixture of both. The title Lady Colin Campbell has outlasted the marriage by more than half a century. Lord Colin himself is a footnote in his own family's history. A younger son who gave his name to a woman and then watched from an ever-increasing distance as she made that name more famous than any Campbell of Argyle had been since the Duchess, whose divorce had scandalized the nation in 1963. The woman who bore his name for 9 months has made it one of the most recognizable personal brands in British media. She has outlasted the tabloids that tried to define her. She has outlasted the establishment that tried to exclude her. She has outlasted the critics who dismissed her Diana books as fabrication, many of whose specific dismissals were overtaken by events that proved her broadly correct. She has outlasted the publishing industry that first embraced her and then moved on, adapting to each new medium, hardback, paperback, television, reality show, YouTube, with the flexibility of someone who understands that the content never changes, only the delivery system, and that the public's appetite for the private lives of the powerful is the one market that never closes. Castle Goring still stands. Its roof no longer leaks, or at least it leaks less than it did when she bought it. Its rooms have been restored, or are being restored, with the slow patience of a woman who has learned, through 76 years of living, that the things worth building take longer than anyone expects and cost more than anyone budgets for. The gardens have been reclaimed from wildness. The entrance hall has been brought back to something approaching its original grandeur. Visitors come for events, for tours, for the weddings and receptions and corporate gatherings that provide the revenue a listed building needs to survive. They walk through rooms that Lady Colin Campbell has filled with her own furniture, her own paintings, her own sense of how a grand house should look and feel. And they see, whether they know it or not, the physical manifestation of a will so fierce that it turned a crumbling shell into a habitable home. The castle is her monument, not to wealth, which she never had in abundance, and not to aristocracy, which she acquired by marriage and lost by divorce and reconstructed by pure determination, but to will itself. Sheer, unrelenting, sometimes infuriating, occasionally magnificent will. The will of a girl who was registered as a boy and lived for 21 years inside a lie. The will of a woman who married a duke's son after 5 days and walked out of the marriage 9 months later with nothing but his name. The will of an author who told the truth about Diana before anyone believed her and kept insisting she had been right long after the world had moved on. The will of a mother who crossed continents to adopt 2 children and funded their upbringing by selling the secrets of the most powerful family in Britain. The will, above all, of a person who refused, at every stage, in every arena, against every opponent, to accept the version of herself that other people wanted to impose. Misha and Dima are adults now. The boys she rescued from Russian orphanages in the early 1990s and raised on royalties from royal biographies and earnings from television appearances have grown into men whose lives their mother does not discuss in public with the same frequency or the same relish with which she discusses the lives of the Windsors. That reticence is itself one of the most revealing details in the entire Lady Colin Campbell story. The woman who built her career on the principle that private lives are public property has maintained, around her own children, a boundary of privacy so firm that it amounts to a philosophy. Their names are known, their existence is acknowledged, but the details of their adult lives, their careers, their relationships, their feelings about growing up as the sons of the most controversial royal commentator in Britain, are not offered to the public, and the public, for the most part, has not demanded them. Whether that constitutes hypocrisy or maternal wisdom depends once again on which version of Lady Colin Campbell the viewer has chosen to believe in. If she is primarily an exploiter, a woman who monetized the private suffering of others without scruple, then the privacy she extends to her own children is evidence of a double standard so brazen that it verges on the comic. If she is primarily a survivor, a woman who did what she had to do to build a life for herself and her family in a world that had offered her no quarter, then the privacy she extends to her children is evidence that she always understood the value of what she was selling and that she chose, with full awareness of the cost, to sell other people's privacy rather than her own children's. The documentary cannot resolve this tension. It can only present it and trust the viewer to decide. The absence of those who shaped her story is felt in the present, as it always is in stories that span decades and generations. The grandmother who funded the surgery, the quiet hero of Act 1, the woman who saw the truth when everyone around her was committed to the lie, is gone. Gloria, the mother whose difficult shadow haunts the pages of Daughter of Narcissus, and whose influence can be traced through every subsequent relationship Lady C formed with institutions that promised love and delivered control, is gone. The 11th Duke of Argyll, whose catastrophic divorce set the pattern that his son would repeat and that his daughter-in-law would eventually monetize, died long before any of this story began to unfold. Margaret, Duchess of Argyll, who endured the first iteration of the Argyll machinery of intimate destruction and who never recovered from it, who spent the last decades of her life in reduced circumstances, her reputation never restored, her story not yet retold with the sympathy it deserved, is gone. Diana, Princess of Wales, whose life and death gave Lady C her greatest commercial success and her deepest moral complication, whose private suffering became public entertainment and then public industry, is gone. Dead at 36 in a Paris tunnel, survived by 2 sons and by an apparatus of remembrance and interpretation and commercial exploitation that shows no sign of diminishing. Even Lord Colin, the man who gave Georgia the name that would outlast everything else about him, the man who, in her telling, beat her and betrayed her and handed her most intimate secret to the press, has receded so far from public visibility that his current circumstances are barely a footnote in the story his ex-wife continues to dominate. What remains is the woman herself, and the castle, and the name. 3 things she built, or acquired, or fought for, or refused to surrender. 3 things that together constitute the answer she has spent 76 years composing to the question that was first posed in a Jamaican nursery in 1949. Who is she? She was first made publicly vulnerable by a false story about her body, and she spent the rest of her life making a living from stories about other people's private lives. That is not a moral, it is not an accusation, it is not a defense, It is the shape of a life lived in the gap between the surface story and the real story, between the public name and the private person, between the version of events that powerful institutions prefer and the version that someone eventually insists on telling. Lady Colin Campbell understood earlier than most that in elite British life, privacy is a fiction distributed unequally. Some people get to keep it, some people have it taken from them. And some people, once stripped of it, decide that if the world is going to live off private pain, they may as well own a share of the business. She stands now at 76 in the entrance hall of a castle she bought with the proceeds of that understanding, and the question of whether she is a truth teller or an exploiter, a survivor or an opportunist, a woman of courage or a woman without scruple, remains exactly as unanswerable as it has been for the last 50 years, which is perhaps exactly how she wants it. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There is more to come.